Welcome to the historic Blah, a place where the past moves very slowly, where kings wrote letters that took months to arrive, and farmers counted the seasons, one gentle sunrise at a time. Tonight we'll wander through the calm corridors of history, no wars, no drama, just the quiet turning of time. So take a deep breath, let your thoughts drift like leaves on a still pond. And if you find peace in these sleepy stories, you can like, comment, and subscribe, not out of urgency, but simply whenever you wake up. For now, close your eyes and let history whisper you to sleep. Welcome to Beautifully Boring History. Let us now begin the journey with Story 1: The Beaked Mask, Origins and Symbolism of the Plague Doctor Costume. The image is instantly recognizable, even centuries later. A dark figure, cloaked in black, face hidden behind a long beak-like mask, moving silently through the alleys of a disease-stricken town. You've likely seen it in modern depictions of the Black Death or costume parties where the macabre is fashionable. But behind this strange attire lies a surprisingly practical and misunderstood history. In the early 17th century, as Europe reeled from recurring waves of plague, an idea emerged: to protect doctors from the invisible threat of pestilence. The result was not just protective gear, but a symbol of medical rationality clashing with superstition. The mask, long and avian, was no mere ornament. It was an early attempt at filtration. The elongated beak held dried herbs: lavender, myrrh, mint, rose petals, and even camphor. The belief that bad air, or miasma, caused the disease. By scenting the air one breathed, a doctor could avoid inhaling this deadly vapor. This idea of miasma had deep roots, going back to Hippocrates and Galenic theories that saw illness as stemming from imbalanced humors or corrupted air. Plague doctors didn't understand bacteria or viruses, but they understood patterns. Proximity to the sick often led to sickness. And so, they developed a form of passive protection. The beak mask was paired with round glass goggles and a waxed leather coat, covering the entire body. Gloves, boots, and a wide-brimmed hat completed the outfit. It was an armor of sorts, not against arrows or bullets, but against the unseen forces of decay and infection. It's tempting to think of the plague doctor costume as widely used during the Black Death of the 14th century. But in truth, it didn't become prominent until much later, especially in 17th century France and Italy. One of the earliest documented uses comes from Charles de Lorme, the chief physician to King Louis XIII, who described the outfit in detail around 1619. He recommended the beaked mask, a protective garment coated in wax, and a wand to examine patients without touch. This wand, sometimes a wooden stick or a thin cane, served not only to maintain distance, but to point, prod, and perhaps signal instructions to others. It may seem absurd today, but at a time when even approaching the sick could spell death, such distancing was a rational act. And yet the costume's fearsome appearance only added to public panic. Villagers who saw the beaked doctor approaching often ran in fear, knowing it meant plague had arrived. The costume became a grim omen. Its appearance in a town square, moving slowly and silently, was as chilling as the tolling of the death bell. The construction of the costume itself is telling. The waxed fabric wasn't chosen for aesthetic. It was believed to repel fluids: blood, sweat, and other substances associated with contagion. The hat signified the doctor's profession, but also acted as a makeshift helmet of social authority. These weren't typical street physicians, after all. Plague doctors were often contracted by municipalities, their role not to cure, but to document, manage, and in some cases perform autopsies. The boots and gloves were essential in preventing direct skin contact. Though germ theory hadn't been formulated, practitioners knew enough to notice that proximity, and particularly touch, led to infection. A waxed robe provided a seal of sorts. Whether it worked or not remains debated, but it did allow the wearer a psychological, if not biological, barrier. Historians continue to debate whether the mask actually provided any protection. The herbs inside may have marginally filtered the air. The sealed clothing may have offered some degree of barrier protection. But in a world without antibiotics, with crowded living conditions, and no knowledge of how fleas or rats spread disease, it's unlikely the beaked mask saved many lives. Still, its very existence shows an early form of personal protective equipment, PPE. It foreshadowed modern hazmat suits in its design logic. The difference, of course, is in the details based on flawed science. The suit addressed the wrong enemy, yet it offered something else, a system, a procedure, a way to interact with the plague while feeling less helpless. Interestingly, some scholars suggest the costume was as much about ritual as it was about safety. The act of donning it marked a transformation from man to medical agent. It was theatrical, yes, but also procedural. Much like modern-day emergency protocols, it created a barrier between ordinary life and the extraordinary world of pestilence management. Over time, the beaked mask became an icon not just of historical medicine, but of fear itself. In 18th century carnival masks in Venice, the Medico della Peste became a character in Commedia dell'arte. This blending of medical history with performance art only deepened the mask's mystique. Paintings and woodcuts from plague periods often feature the masked figure looming over suffering patients or conducting burials. The depiction was as much symbolic as literal, conveying the alienation of medical science, the cold distance of diagnosis in a time of despair. For some townsfolk, the doctor was a savior, for others, a harbinger, but for nearly all, the beaked mask became unforgettable. As night fell across plague-touched towns and candles flickered in shuttered windows, the quiet clip of boots across cobblestones signaled that the doctor had arrived not to heal, but to witness, record, and protect themselves as best they could. But who were the men behind the masks, and how did they carry out their duties among so much death? The costume itself, the long beak, the waxed robes, the wide-brimmed hat has become a symbol of the plague era. But for all its notoriety, far less is known about the individuals who wore it. Behind the anonymity of the mask were men of varying training, experience, and motivation. They were not all revered physicians, nor were they uniformly qualified. In many cases, plague doctors were men of desperation, opportunism, or simply those without other options. But they were also archivists of disease, quiet bureaucrats in a world unraveling at the seams. Despite what modern images might suggest, plague doctors were not primarily healers. Their official duties were often far more administrative. Cities, towns, and parishes hired plague doctors to perform public functions. They recorded the number of infected, kept death tallies, conducted basic examinations, and performed post-mortem inspections when necessary. In some cases, they even helped draft wills. These doctors were civil servants of a sort. Hired by municipalities during outbreaks, their contracts often specified fixed terms, special housing, food provisions, and stipulations for their conduct. Some were granted full protection and exemption from taxes, while others were given extra pay to compensate for the high risk of death. Many towns did not attract well-trained physicians to these posts. Wealthier doctors often fled cities during plague waves, leaving behind the poor, the young, the reckless, or the unknown to take their place. Some were recent medical graduates. Others had no formal training at all. The position was, at best, unstable, at worst lethal. The identity of plague doctors varied widely depending on the region and the century. In 17th century France and Italy, where the beaked mask was most prevalent, city councils hired plague doctors through public contracts. Charles de Lorme, the aforementioned royal physician, was an exception, a man of skill and standing, but he set the template for others who followed. Some plague doctors were trained in the Galenic tradition, having studied medicine at universities in Padua, Montpellier, or Bologna. But many more were barbers, apothecaries, or even failed clergy who took up the role for income, status, or lack of alternatives. A few were foreign physicians brought in when locals refused the position. In certain cases, prisoners or debtors accepted the job as a path to freedom. Historical records from Italian city-states like Venice, Florence, and Rome suggest that plague doctors were often overworked and undersupplied. They faced danger not just from disease, but from suspicion. Accusations of theft from the dead, misdiagnosis, and corruption were common. And given the opacity of the mask and the power granted by municipal roles, some did indeed take advantage of their station. Still, many tried to fulfill their duties, keeping careful records, cataloging symptoms, and passing on observations that would one day inform modern epidemiology. Plague doctors often carried more than just their cane. Many kept ledgers in which they recorded symptoms, patient names, days of onset, and signs of death. These logs were essential to public health officials trying to track the spread of disease. While rudimentary and often inconsistent, such records are among the earliest examples of municipal health surveillance. The isolation of their role cannot be overstated. Plague doctors lived on the margins of society during outbreaks. Some were housed in city-funded rooms at the edge of town. Others were forced to isolate for months at a time, with food left at their door. If they did make house calls, they often weren't welcomed warmly. Fear of contamination, theft, or worse kept most citizens at arm's length. Letters and documents from the period describe plague doctors as somber, tired, and emotionally numb. They walked through streets lined with the sick and dying, making decisions with little power to change outcomes. In some cities, they worked alongside gravediggers, watchmen, or quarantine guards. In others, they were left entirely on their own. The psychological toll was severe. One account from Naples describes a plague doctor returning from his rounds to find his own assistant dead on the floor. Another from Marseille recounts a physician writing to his wife about his dreams haunted by faceless bodies and ringing bells. It's important to remember that the plague doctor was not universally respected. In many places, they were seen as harbingers of doom. Their presence indicated infection, their attire a visual reminder of society's frailty. Some people accused them of bringing the plague rather than preventing it. The long beak, alien to the public, was viewed by some as a tool of secrecy or even sorcery. In a few towns, citizens rioted when plague doctors arrived, believing they were agents of government cover-ups or foreign infiltrators. In more remote villages, they were sometimes attacked or run off. Religious figures occasionally clashed with plague doctors, particularly when doctrines differed on the causes and treatment of disease. Where priests urged prayer and penance, doctors prescribed poultices and vinegar washes. These differences created friction, particularly in deeply Catholic regions. In Protestant areas, where scientific medicine was more accepted, plague doctors sometimes found more support. Yet even there, their limited success rate made them the targets of frustration. After all, most people they treated still died. To understand the challenges plague doctors faced, we must consider the limits of their medical knowledge. The prevailing theory miasma focused on air as the vehicle of illness. Hence the reliance on scented herbs, smoke, and ventilation. Medical practice was guided by Galenic theory, which suggested that health depended on the balance of four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Plague doctors often prescribed bloodletting, purging, or the application of leeches. Others recommended sweating, the use of mercury compounds, or ingestion of herbal mixtures with opium. Few of these remedies worked, and some were fatal in themselves. What they lacked in efficacy, however, they made up for in documentation. Many plague doctors wrote treatises based on their experiences, describing symptoms, stages of illness, and environmental conditions. These records became valuable for later physicians studying patterns of contagion. It's worth noting that many plague doctors also worked closely with apothecaries, midwives, and folk healers. In some regions, they adopted local remedies out of desperation. In others, they rejected them entirely. This tension between formal medicine and vernacular healing created a complex, and often confusing, landscape of care. While the beaked mask offered limited physical protection, it served a powerful psychological function. For the doctor, it was a barrier not just against disease, but against the emotional weight of constant death. For the public, it created a ritual of separation. The mask told them, "This is no longer a man but an agent of the plague." This alienation, while painful, helped doctors maintain distance. It allowed them to perform duties that others could not bear. In many ways, the costume gave them the permission to keep going to become, however briefly, something beyond human. And so, as the plague doctor walked the quiet streets at dusk, mask hiding his face, robe brushing against the cobblestones, he bore not just the tools of medicine, but the burdens of observation, judgment, and survival. But what became of them after the plague passed? Were they remembered, rewarded, or simply forgotten behind the beak and cloak? The plague doctor, moving silently through the death-ridden cities of Europe, became a living icon of both hope and fear. But as plagues waned and medical science advanced, the once practical purpose of the costume began to fade. And yet, curiously, the legacy of the beaked mask outlasted its medical usefulness, embedding itself into the cultural memory of disease and mortality. This final section explores what happened to these enigmatic figures when the plague subsided, how they were remembered or not, how the costume evolved in collective consciousness, and why even today, centuries later, the beaked doctor still walks through our nightmares, carnivals, and pandemic anxieties. Plague doctors, despite their central presence during outbreaks, were not often celebrated after the disease passed. Many vanished from public record. Contracts expired. Some died from the very illness they tried to monitor. Others moved on to different, less morbid roles. A few, particularly those who had produced written accounts or treatises, remained in academic circles, but the vast majority simply faded into obscurity. There were no statues built for them, no holidays to commemorate their service. Their uniforms, once standard in cities like Marseille, Paris, or Venice, were often burned or discarded as potential carriers of contagion. Unlike military uniforms or religious vestments, the plague doctor's garb carried a curse of association. No one wanted to be reminded of it once the bells stopped tolling. The public attitude toward them was ambivalent. They had been necessary, but they had not been saviors. Most people they visited still perished. Their protective suits, their wands, their ledgers, none could stop the Black Death. In many regions, their very presence had increased fear and panic. In a world where success was measured in survival, the plague doctor had little legacy to boast of. Still, a quiet respect lingered in certain records. Municipal councils sometimes honored their service with pensions or letters of commendation, but no great monuments were raised. Their work, like the disease they managed, was meant to be buried. As the understanding of contagion shifted in the 18th and 19th centuries from miasma to germ theory, the rationale behind the beaked mask collapsed. The herbs, once thought to cleanse foul air, were recognized as ineffective. The long leather gowns and waxed claws, while marginally useful, were no match for the microscopic agents of infection. The costume became obsolete, though not immediately. Some records indicate that plague-related attire, including beaked masks, was still in use during outbreaks in Marseille in 1720 and later in Russia during the 1770s. But by the mid-19th century, such attire was seen as archaic, more a relic of ignorance than a tool of science. As hospitals modernized and protective gear became based on sanitation rather than scent, the old uniform was discarded. Medical uniforms began emphasizing cleanliness and sterility: white coats, gloves, antiseptics. The mask disappeared from practice, retreating into the shadows of historical illustration and rumor. And yet, it did not vanish entirely. Strangely, what medicine discarded, art embraced. In Venice, where plague doctors had once roamed the narrow canals and alleys, the Medico della Peste returned not in clinics but in carnivals. During the famous Venetian carnival, revelers wore versions of the beaked mask as part of elaborate costumes. Once symbols of dread, they became curiosities, theatrical accessories for a society that had survived. The carnival mask was stylized, often painted white, gold, or black, with exaggerated features. It bore little resemblance to the rough leather and utilitarian design of the original, yet it maintained the long beak, the empty gaze, and the air of anonymity. In this setting, the mask became parody and homage all at once, a ghost from a darker age, now made manageable through ritual and celebration. This shift was more than fashion. It was psychological. The beaked mask, once a real tool of plague management, had transformed into a symbol, a metaphor for death, detachment, or even bureaucratic absurdity. In the 19th century, Romantic artists used the image to evoke the grotesque. Later, it appeared in theater, literature, and eventually film. The legacy of the mask survived not because it cured disease, but because it represented it. In the 20th and 21st centuries, the plague doctor returned again, this time through popular culture. Gothic novels, horror films, graphic novels, and even video games resurrected the image. The beaked mask became a visual shorthand for contagion, secrecy, and eerie calm. You may have seen it in steampunk designs, historical horror fiction, or even memes. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the plague doctor reappeared on social media and in street art, a reminder of past pandemics and the cyclical nature of human response to disease. Historians, too, found new interest in the figure. The plague doctor became a subject of study not just for medical historians, but for those exploring visual culture, fear, and public health policy. Medical museums began displaying replicas of the costume. Academic articles unpacked its meaning. Lectures and documentaries featured it prominently. What was once a tool of practical medicine had become a symbol, abstract, powerful, and strangely enduring. The plague doctor's story is not one of heroism in the traditional sense. These were not miracle workers. Most didn't save lives. They didn't discover cures. Many were underqualified. Some were corrupt. Others simply took the job because they had no other choice. But in their own way, they represent something deeply human. The desire to face death with structure, to understand chaos through ritual, and to give form to fear. They remind us that even in the darkest of times, societies try to organize the unorganizable. They create protocols, costumes, and hierarchies not because they are effective, but because they offer a sense of order. In that sense, the beaked mask is not just a medical artifact. It is a psychological one. Today, as we continue to grapple with pandemics, misinformation, and the limits of medical science, the plague doctor's legacy feels oddly familiar. The mask, once designed to shield the doctor from miasma, now shields us from the realization that we are still learning, still vulnerable, still seeking meaning in the midst of disease. And so, the figure lingers in our cultural imagination, not because of what he accomplished, but because of what he represents, the attempt to remain human in a time of death. Story 2. Soot and Vinegar, Homemade Remedies in 17th Century Households. In the face of plague, when trained physicians were few and their treatments uncertain, most people turned inward, not to prayer alone, but to the humble materials within their homes. In the kitchens and backrooms of 17th century Europe, especially among the lower classes, medicine was not bought but brewed. The home became both sanctuary and sick ward. Every pot, herb bundle, and bottle of vinegar had a possible curative role to play. In this first section, we will step inside the domestic world of everyday people during plague years, households where soot was medicine, vinegar was armor, and hope was preserved in jars and dried leaves. Unlike war or fire, the plague did not strike with a visible army or an obvious enemy. It crept in through a neighbor's cough, a traveler's coat, or the simple act of bringing food to the table. And when it came, there was little time to prepare. By the time towns posted quarantine orders or watchmen nailed shut the infected doors, families were already turning to what they had at hand. Most homes had no access to physicians. Even where plague doctors operated, they were outnumbered, distant, or distrusted. So mothers, midwives, widowers, and the elderly became the primary caretakers. Their apothecaries were kitchen shelves. Their manuals were word-of-mouth advice, folk traditions, and hand-written plague receipts, not receipts for purchases, but instructions or recipes for homemade medicine. These household remedies were not always effective, but they were rarely random. They emerged from generations of observation and belief, refined by local knowledge and community memory. And though the science was flawed, the effort itself reflects a quiet resilience and insistence on doing something in the face of overwhelming threat. If there was one substance that united plague homes across Europe, it was vinegar. Distilled from wine, beer, or apple cider, vinegar was cheap, widely available, and strongly scented exactly what people believed was needed to counteract foul air. Vinegar was used in dozens of ways. As a hand wash, people rinsed their hands after returning from markets or graveyards. As an inhalant, cloths soaked in vinegar were held under the nose to filter miasma. As a cleaner, surfaces, doorknobs, and even floors were wiped with vinegar to ward off contagion. As a drink, mixed with water and honey, vinegar was swallowed in hopes of cleansing the humors. As a component in the famed Four Thieves vinegar, a concoction said to protect grave robbers during the plague. The origin story of the Four Thieves vinegar is, in itself, a piece of folklore. According to various legends, four thieves were caught stealing from plague victims' homes in Toulouse. When brought before a magistrate, they offered the recipe for their immunity in exchange for leniency. The recipe, varying by region, usually included rosemary, thyme, garlic, sage, and of course, vinegar. Whether or not it worked is doubtful, but people believed it did, and belief during plague years was often the most potent remedy available. Beyond vinegar, another common household tool was fire and its byproducts. In many homes, especially in England and the Low Countries, it was believed that smoke could cleanse the air. Not just any smoke, but specific smokes, from burning juniper, pitch, amber, or rosemary. Soot, the black residue left on fireplace walls and cooking pots, also had medicinal applications. Some mixed it with animal fat or vinegar to create a paste, which was then applied to buboes, those painful swellings in the groin or underarms associated with plague. Charred bread, too, had its place. Ground into powder and mixed with honey or egg yolk, it was spread on wounds or taken as an internal cleanser. In some cases, burned parchment, preferably from a Bible page, was crumbled and swallowed with wine. The logic behind these remedies was not arbitrary. Darkness, ash, and burning were symbolically linked with purification. Fire could destroy bodies, cleanse sins, or banish invisible threats. In the absence of antiseptics or knowledge of pathogens, people relied on what they could see: smoke rising, flames crackling as evidence of action. Nearly every household, rural or urban, maintained some form of herbal stock. Whether growing in a window box, hanging from ceiling beams, or purchased at a local market, herbs were indispensable in plague-time remedies. Commonly used herbs included lavender, for scenting linens and vinegar; rosemary and thyme, burned or boiled for aromatic cleansing; sage, eaten infused or added to vinegar washes; rue, believed to repel illness and even demons; garlic and onion, applied raw to buboes or boiled into broths. Many of these herbs were also culinary staples, blurring the line between food and medicine. A stew might include garlic for taste and protection. Tea brewed with mint or sage was both comfort and treatment. Old manuscripts often copied by hand and passed through generations contained herbal receipts for treating fever, purging bad humors, or inducing sweat. Sweating was commonly believed to expel the illness, and entire routines were built around creating a plague bath with herbs, hot stones, and wrapped blankets. In wealthier households, apothecary cabinets held dried herbs labeled in Latin. In poorer homes, bundles hung from rafters or were pressed into wax for later use. Even children learned to recognize plants, gathering them under the supervision of elders as part of seasonal rhythms. Not all household treatments were plant-based. Folk medicine also called on animal ingredients, particularly in more rural or isolated regions. These included dried toad powder, used to draw out poisons; goose grease or lard, mixed with herbs for poultices; crushed pearls or bone, believed to balance humors or strengthen the heart; pig's blood or bile, rare but sometimes applied to buboes in certain traditions. In some cases, a whole dead toad or pigeon was placed on a swollen lymph node, under the belief that it would draw out the infection. This was often followed by prayers or ritual gestures, such as crossing the afflicted area or reciting protective verses. These treatments seem gruesome or absurd by today's standards, but they were guided by deeply held cosmologies of balance, extraction, and sacred order. Sickness was not just biological, it was also spiritual, environmental, and moral. Medicine in the home was not only physical, it was deeply social and emotional. Women, in particular, bore the burden of care. Wives, mothers, grandmothers, and midwives cleaned the sick, maintained herbal stores, boiled cloths, and buried the dead. Their labor was rarely documented, but it was essential. There were rituals around entering a sick room, fumigating it with herbs, washing with vinegar, reciting psalms. Family members often fasted or performed acts of contrition, believing that illness was divine punishment. Candles burned in bedrooms. Herbs were placed under pillows. Mirrors were covered, and windows left open even in winter so that the disease might escape. In Protestant regions, printed pamphlets offered household guides to dealing with plague. In Catholic areas, prayers to saints like Sebastian or Roch were included in family Bibles. Even in regions with limited literacy, oral traditions passed down instructions for care and purification. The home became a theater of survival, half science, half spirituality, where people fought to preserve life with the only weapons they had: vinegar, soot, prayer, and habit. Even as the plague tightened its grip, households resisted in their own quiet ways through boiling water, hanging herbs, and binding wounds. The humble routines of daily life became acts of defiance against the randomness of death. But which of these remedies actually worked? And how did medical authorities respond to this growing body of folk knowledge? By the time plague had become a recurring fixture of early modern life, the ordinary home had taken on the dual role of both infirmary and laboratory. Kitchen herbs simmered beside boiling vinegar. Ash and soot were applied with prayer and intention. Yet while these remedies shaped daily survival, they also brought these humble households into uneasy tension with authorities, physicians, and the church. In this section, we explore how household knowledge clashed with elite medical opinion, how remedies were shared and adapted across social lines, and how communities navigated the blurred line between healing, superstition, and regulation. By the 17th century, the divide between learned and folk medicine had widened. University-trained physicians, steeped in the works of Galen, Hippocrates, and Avicenna, saw themselves as heirs to classical knowledge. Their language was Latin, their tools were bloodletting knives and philosophical texts, and their audience was elite. In contrast, most people relied on remedies passed down orally, receipts kept in worn notebooks or transmitted grandmother to granddaughter. These remedies, often created by trial, error, and communal memory, were dismissed by professionals as unscientific or even dangerous, yet they were rooted in lived experience. If a mixture of rosemary and wine had once helped with fever, it was remembered. Conflict arose when municipal authorities tried to control the spread of information. In plague years, certain towns banned the sale of unlicensed remedies, especially those involving animal parts, alchemy, or superstition. Vendors selling herb bundles or homemade tinctures at market could be fined or imprisoned. Women, in particular, were vulnerable to accusations of witchcraft or charlatanry. Even so, these domestic healers continued to operate. In rural areas, they often had more trust than city physicians. After all, they didn't demand coin up front or abandon the town during outbreaks. The invention of the printing press brought a new development in household medicine: the wide distribution of plague books and home medical guides. These booklets, often cheaply printed, offered recipes for poultices, cordials, fumigants, and preventive diets. One popular English publication, A Direction for the Health of Magistrates and People in Time of Plague, published in 1603, listed dozens of recipes such as: take a good handful of sage, rosemary, and rue with a whole head of garlic, boil in strong vinegar, wash thy face and hands with this thrice daily. Others recommended mixing powdered coral, ground unicorn horn, or its equivalent, such as narwhal tusk, and rose water to produce an antipestilential electuary. While many of these ingredients were fanciful or symbolic, some combinations had mild antibacterial or calming effects. The printed manuals blended Galenic theory with popular lore, offering a compromise between elite and popular medicine. These books were rarely used by the illiterate, but they often made their way into the hands of clergy, merchants, and schoolteachers intermediaries, who would then share the knowledge locally. Urban markets became both a lifeline and a source of risk during plague years. Households that lacked their own gardens or livestock had to purchase ingredients: herbs, vinegar, wine, dried roots, sulfur, pitch, and even ground minerals from local vendors. Plague cure stalls appeared during outbreaks, selling premixed tonics, herbal bundles to hang from door frames, or little cloth sachets to wear around the neck. One such item, called a plague ball, was a small pouch filled with camphor, cloves, and lavender, carried like an amulet or suspended from hats and belts. The ingredients varied by region and class. In the Netherlands, where trade brought exotic goods, recipes included cinnamon, nutmeg, or saffron. In more remote areas, common substitutes were used, such as juniper berries, moss, and vinegar made from sour apples. These markets reflected a patchwork economy of survival. Remedies were adapted according to what was affordable and available. Poorer families often substituted cheaper herbs or reused cloth soaked in last week's vinegar bath. The rich could afford finer oils and access to apothecaries who stocked imported goods. Yet even among the elite, reliance on home remedies remained high. Servants would be tasked with preparing herbal mixtures. Nobles maintained herb gardens not just for cuisine, but for healing. Even in the 17th century, the spread of bad medical advice was a real and deadly issue. Quacks, individuals offering false cures for coin, roamed plague-ridden towns, peddling miracle waters and protective stones. Some claimed to possess plague-proof candles made from beeswax and special herbs. Others sold printed charms or instructed buyers to wear specific colors, avoid pork, or tie a red ribbon around their ankles. For those in despair, even the most illogical remedy offered hope. Rumors circulated that horses could sense plague, or that a virgin's breath could cure fever. Some households followed astrological calendars to decide when to bleed a patient or open windows. Authorities occasionally tried to regulate this chaos. In Florence, for example, city officials published approved recipes during outbreaks, posted on church doors, and distributed to households. In London, the College of Physicians issued public warnings against certain powders and unlawful oils. But enforcement was inconsistent, and panic often overrode regulation. The same candle that one neighbor trusted for healing, another blamed for bringing death. It's impossible to explore homemade remedies without acknowledging the central role of women. Across Europe, it was women mothers, midwives, nuns, and herbalists who preserved and prepared most household cures. Their knowledge, drawn from generations of domestic labor, was often far more practical than the theories of physicians. Yet this authority came at a cost. When treatments failed, women were easy scapegoats. Midwives, especially, were vulnerable to suspicion. In times of heightened fear, they might be accused of using black herbs, making pacts with devils, or intentionally spreading disease. In parts of Germany and France, trials for witchcraft surged during plague years. The very knowledge that made these women invaluable, recognizing fever stages, treating wounds, preparing herbal oils, also made them threatening. Even outside of formal accusations, social stigma persisted. Women who lived alone, tended to the sick, or sold healing items were seen with suspicion. Ironically, it was often their success in healing that drew the most ire, especially when male physicians failed to produce better results. Still, women remained central to the home's response to plague. They boiled linens, burned sulfur, prayed over the sick, buried the dead, and carried on. To modern eyes, many household remedies from the 17th century may seem like superstition, but in their time, they occupied a space between reason and ritual. People saw no contradiction between applying a vinegar poultice and reciting Psalm 91. To them, physical and spiritual protection were intertwined. Many remedies were accompanied by gestures, whispering prayers while applying ointment, tracing crosses over a bubo with one's fingers, placing amulets above doorways while sweeping ash across thresholds. Some households kept items like dried bat wings, bones, or preserved hearts not as trophies, but as protective talismans. The line between apothecary and altar was faint. The church both tolerated and challenged these practices. Priests sometimes blessed vinegar or herbs, especially during sanctioned plague processions. But they also condemned pagan rituals or folk charms. Households thus operated in a delicate dance, seeking healing while staying within social and religious boundaries. In this tangled world of soot and vinegar, faith and fever, the home became a microcosm of plague-time life, resourceful, contradictory, and deeply human. But what happened when these humble efforts failed? When the plague continued to spread despite all the vinegar baths and rosemary bundles? The remedies brewed in quiet kitchens, scented cloths, herbal infusions, soot-based poultices offered 17th century families a fragile shield against the unstoppable force of plague. But what happens when that shield fails? In this final section, we explore the limitations of household remedies, how people coped when cures didn't work, and the longer-lasting cultural imprint of plague-time domestic medicine. These homes, so full of improvisation and devotion, reveal not only survival strategies but emotional blueprints for navigating fear. In a world with no vaccines, no germ theory, and little institutional support, the hearth was where courage and failure met. Despite every wash in vinegar and every herb strung across the bedposts, the plague often still entered. It came quietly, a mild fever, a sudden chill, and then erupted in unmistakable signs: blackened swellings, vomiting, delirium. Home cures were immediately put to the test. Some families escalated their interventions. Warm plasters of garlic or onion were applied to buboes. Patients were wrapped in hot blankets and made to sweat. Others were purged with syrup of rhubarb or vinegar tonics, hopping to flush the poison out. But many found themselves helpless. The most painful reality for caregivers, especially mothers and midwives, was not just the failure of the remedies, but the burden of hope they carried. When a loved one died, it was hard not to blame the failed bath, the missed herb, or the prayer that didn't work. There are countless letters, journals, and parish records describing households losing 2, 3, even 5 members in a matter of days. Sometimes, entire homes were found silent, sealed from the outside with no survivors within. In plague time, even mourning was reshaped. Traditional funerals were often forbidden. Public burials, processions, and wakes were replaced by hurried removals, lime pits, and mass graves. Families who had once washed and dressed their dead were now instructed not to touch them. Still, domestic rituals persisted. When formal rites failed, households improvised. A candle was lit. Psalms were whispered. A sprig of rosemary might be placed in a corpse's hand. Blankets were wrapped carefully, bodies laid out with dignity, even when no one was coming to carry them away. In Protestant homes, the focus shifted toward inner reflection. In Catholic homes, families left votive offerings to plague saints. In both, the act of care, even for the dead, was a form of resistance. Children especially were remembered with tokens: ribbons, carved initials on beams, bits of hair pressed into prayer books. These quiet acts turned memory into medicine, softening grief with ritual. For those who survived or who buried the sick and kept living, the memory of the plague years became etched into the household itself. Rooms were repainted, windows were unshuttered, herbs were replaced, linens burned, but the sick room lingered in memory. People spoke of smells: vinegar, lavender, smoke that never truly left. Some avoided entire corners of their homes, believing them still marked by illness. Others maintained small shrines or memorials near hearths, blending healing and mourning. The trauma of caregiving, especially among women and children, remained unspoken but deep. The house became both a shelter and a grave, yet many families in time rebuilt. Gardens were planted again, kitchens were restocked, vinegar jars refilled. These acts, mundane as they seem, were quiet victories. In the aftermath of outbreaks, survivors often became sources of knowledge. Midwives who had tended the dying became informal experts. Men who had recorded recipes or observed cures passed on their notes. Women handed down dried herbs along with stories of what worked and what didn't. Thus, a kind of informal epidemiology emerged, not in laboratories, but around firesides and market stalls. A daughter might learn that rue and rosemary helped a cousin's fever. A neighbor might share a better way to prepare a poultice. This oral tradition ensured that even in the absence of formal education, a kind of cultural immune system developed based on shared memory and trial and error. In some villages, surviving families took on semi-official roles in later outbreaks, offering advice, care, and calm. Their authority was born not of books, but of having lived through plague and come out the other side. By the time Europe entered the Enlightenment, the power of household medicine had not diminished, it had evolved. Though scientific medicine gained traction in elite circles, the ordinary home continued to rely on soot, vinegar, and herbs. The survival of families during earlier plague waves had proven that even simple remedies, used correctly, could offer comfort if not cure. Printed household manuals became more common. Women's roles as caregivers and home healers remained central. In rural areas especially, formal doctors were still rare and distrusted. Many families kept recipe books of family cures, passed down for generations, some of which traced directly back to plague-era knowledge. In more modern times, vinegar and herbs lost their mystical associations, but retained their utility. Even today, natural remedies often reflect ingredients that were once used during the plague, not because they're magical, but because they were among the few tools people had. The kitchen, the hearth, the herb rack, these were places where medicine and memory overlapped. The soot-darkened walls bore witness to the quiet, tireless labor of those who cared for the sick when no one else could. The story of plague-time household medicine isn't one of breakthroughs or scientific progress. It's a story of survival through ritual, routine, and belief. It's the story of a mother who soaked linens in vinegar every day, even as she buried her husband. Of a grandmother who ground soot into a paste with trembling hands. Of a child who watched herbs burn and learned without understanding that this was how the world tried to heal. These were not dramatic acts. They were slow, repetitive, and often futile, but they were consistent. They offered structure in a world unraveling. And maybe that's why they matter. In the end, the plague did not just pass through cities and fields, it passed through kitchens, bedrooms, and backyards. And in each of these small domestic theaters, people did what they could. They cleaned, they brewed, they hoped. And then they taught their children to do the same. Story 3. Locked Inside. Life under quarantine in the Venetian Republic. It is a strange thing to imagine now. A city willingly cutting itself off from the world, shutting its ports, locking its people in, isolating the sick, and appointing guards to patrol the streets not against criminals, but against the breath of one's neighbors. Yet that is exactly what the Republic of Venice did, again and again, across centuries of plague. And not just Venice, but her surrounding territories, towns, and outposts. In a time before vaccines, before microbiology, and before reliable sanitation, the Venetians embraced quarantine not as an act of fear, but of administrative necessity. This section explores how quarantine emerged not as a spontaneous panic, but as a calculated policy. We step into the gated alleys and restricted neighborhoods of the most serene republic during the 14th through 17th centuries, where rules governed breadth, proximity, and even the air that passed through window slats. Venice in the late Middle Ages and early modern period was not just a city of gondolas and palaces. It was a hub of trade, a node in the vast Mediterranean network that brought silks from Asia, spices from the East, and grain from the Balkans. Her lifeblood was commerce, and her greatest vulnerability was that same openness to the world. Ships brought wealth, but they also brought disease. After the Black Death first struck Europe in 1347, Venice began to take drastic action. Within a few decades, the government developed one of the most sophisticated public health systems in Europe. Central to this system was quarantine, from the Italian Quaranta Giorni 40 days. Incoming ships, their cargo, and their passengers could be detained for 40 days before being allowed to dock or disembark. This number had religious overtones: 40 days of Lent, of Noah's flood, of Christ in the desert. But it also reflected observation. Those who did not show symptoms after several weeks were unlikely to be carriers. And so the city built walls, some physical, others legal. Quarantine became not just a health strategy, but a civic duty. To implement quarantine, Venice established lazarettos, purpose-built isolation hospitals on small islands in the lagoon. The Lazaretto Vecchio, first used in 1423, was the earliest known quarantine facility in Europe. It lay just a short boat ride from the city, close enough to manage, far enough to contain danger. Later came the Lazaretto Nuovo, designated primarily for ships and cargo. It was a kind of custom station for disease. Goods were unpacked and aired in the sun. Letters were fumigated with vinegar and smoke. Livestock were held in pens, and sailors were confined to barracks. Inside the lazarettos, the sick were treated, often poorly. The dying were recorded, and the dead were buried nearby. Graveyards were quiet but busy places. Archaeological excavations in recent decades have uncovered hundreds of skeletons, hastily interred during waves of pestilence. But perhaps more than the suffering inside, what remains remarkable is the systematization of it all. The lazarettos were not last-minute shelters, they were planned, staffed, and regulated. A bureaucracy of illness developed, with clerks, guards, and public health officials managing the flow of bodies and goods. The Venetian response to plague was not ad hoc, it was institutional. The Magistrato alla Sanità, or health magistracy, was formed to oversee all matters of public health. This included issuing health passes, coordinating lazaretto operations, inspecting ships, and enforcing quarantines within the city. Health officers maintained detailed records, names of the sick, addresses of suspected households, lists of symptoms, and progress reports. Even in an age of limited medical understanding, the state understood the value of documentation. One of the most striking innovations was the Fede di Sanità, or health certificate. Anyone entering the city, sailor, merchant, diplomat, had to produce one. It attested that the person had spent the required quarantine or was coming from a region deemed clean. Domestically, if a household member fell ill, the entire house could be placed under confinamento lockdown. Officials would post notices on the door, seal the entry, and assign watchmen to prevent exit or entry. Neighbors were warned. Food was delivered sometimes through a guarded system. Trash and waste were collected at night. The rules varied by outbreak, but the principle remained: isolation to protect the community. What did it mean to live under quarantine within the city itself? For the rich, it meant confinement in larger houses, where servants could still move between rooms. For the poor, it meant entire families sharing a single room for weeks, with no escape and few comforts. Windows were sometimes nailed shut. Doors were sealed with wax stamps or wooden bars. Communication happened through cracks in shutters or from balconies. Children grew restless. The elderly suffered. In some cases, neighbors would sing or pray together from separate buildings, each voice drifting across empty courtyards. Authorities occasionally allowed one person per household to leave for essentials, but even this was regulated. Watchmen monitored movements. Violators could be arrested, fined, or publicly shamed. Despite the harshness, compliance was often high, not necessarily out of civic virtue, but because plague was a visible, terrifying presence. People had seen neighbors die. They had smelled the sickness. They had heard the cries. Quarantine may have been boring, suffocating, and even cruel, but it made sense. Living under lockdown took more than just time, it took a toll on the psyche. Personal diaries, where they exist, speak of despair and monotony. People wrote about waiting for symptoms to appear in loved ones, of the terror at a single sneeze. Children cried for air and light. Adults whispered prayers, performed cleansing rituals, or made bargains with saints. There was little to do. Reading material was rare. News was limited. The passage of days blurred. Some counted time by candle drippings. Others scratched marks into doorposts or kept track of meals. There were also social consequences. Households that had been quarantined, even if no one died, were sometimes viewed with suspicion after the quarantine ended. Children might be mocked. Shopkeepers might lose customers. The plague mark lingered longer than the disease itself. Still, families found small comforts, meals shared in silence, songs passed from mother to child, a window opened at dusk. The human spirit, even sealed behind locked doors, endured. For a city of canals and commerce, locking itself down again and again required immense administrative will and a deep acceptance of isolation as a temporary way of life. But could a system so reliant on order survive when disease came faster than bureaucracy could respond? In the first section, we explored the architectural and administrative tools Venice used to build a culture of quarantine, from lazarettos in the lagoon to locked doors within the city itself. But as with all systems of control, cracks began to form. Section 2 reveals the social consequences of long-term quarantine, the development of plague-time bureaucracy, and how ordinary Venetians resisted, adapted, or broke the rules behind the city's stoic exterior. These tensions between survival and freedom, safety and mobility, remain eerily familiar, though we see them here not in a modern metropolis, but on quiet canal banks where gondolas drifted past shuttered homes. By the 16th century, Venice had developed one of the most robust plague response systems in Europe. The Magistrato alla Sanità, or health magistracy, had sweeping powers. It issued lockdown orders, posted health edicts, coordinated the cleaning of streets, and even oversaw surveillance networks of plague informant citizens who reported suspected illnesses to authorities. To prevent mass panic, officials operated with a combination of secrecy and spectacle. Notices were nailed to doors. Entire streets were cordoned off. Guards were stationed on bridges and corners. Bells marked plague deaths, but some were rung softly or not at all to avoid demoralizing the public. Every district or sestiere had appointed health officers, usually local men who acted as liaisons between residents and the central magistrates. They gathered lists of the sick and dead, ensured food reached the quarantined, and occasionally helped enforce fines. Much of this was paper-based: permits to move goods, records of visits, declarations of health. A single Venetian outbreak could produce volumes of handwritten documents, many of which survive today. These offer us a surprisingly detailed picture of plague-time governance, a city trying to manage a biological crisis with bureaucracy and ink. While the wealthiest Venetians could wait out quarantines in their countryside villas or pay for private medical attention, the poor remained in the city. For laborers, artisans, gondoliers, and street vendors, quarantine was not just an inconvenience, it was ruinous. With shops closed, trade halted, and streets patrolled, income vanished. For many, the state's limited food provisions were barely enough. Soup kitchens called ospitali struggled to meet demand. Some families went hungry. Others bartered goods or offered manual labor in exchange for bread. Worse, if a household was suspected of illness, they might be confined for weeks, unable to work or access their small stalls in the markets. Entire economic classes were immobilized, while the city's governing elite moved between guarded halls and summer retreats. To the poor, quarantine could feel less like protection and more like punishment. And when desperation overtook fear, rules were bent. For all the city's walls, islands, and edicts, there was always leakage. Smugglers found ways to bypass quarantine checkpoints, using gondolas under cover of night or bribing guards with coins and goods. Couriers moved letters in secret, risking arrest to avoid official fumigation procedures. Apothecaries continued selling their wares, sometimes from back doors. Priests quietly visited the sick despite bans. Lovers met in alleyways. Workers climbed rooftops to cross between buildings when streets were sealed. Even within the lazarettos, records indicate contraband trade, small exchanges of wine, dried fruit, or even news. Guards were underpaid and occasionally sympathetic. Some turned a blind eye, others profited. Of course, these activities came with risk. If caught, violators faced fines, confinement, or public shamming. Yet the fact that infractions persisted across centuries suggests a deeper truth. People always sought ways to live, even under lockdown. Spiritual life did not stop during quarantines, it simply changed form. Churches closed their doors, but prayers continued. Bells tolled for the dead, but also for divine intercession. Saints associated with plague, particularly Saint Sebastian, Saint Roch, and Saint Mark, were honored in private homes. Some families built shrines in courtyards. Others carried small amulets or wore plague medals around their necks. Religious processions, normally vital in times of crisis, were banned, but in secret. Miniature ones occurred within buildings, with candles and whispered litanies. In some cases, entire communities defied bans. Reports from 1576 describe groups gathering illegally to pray for deliverance in the face of high mortality. The authorities, fearing the spread of contagion, intervened, but their efforts were uneven. The tension between spiritual comfort and civic order was never fully resolved. Eventually, even Venice's rulers recognized that public morale required symbolic action. In 1630, after a particularly deadly wave, the city commissioned the Grand Church of the Redentor on the Giudecca Island, a gesture of thanksgiving and remembrance. It remains one of Venice's iconic plague-era monuments. One of the more curious side effects of repeated quarantines was the development of new social customs, rules, and gestures designed to maintain civility while observing boundaries. For instance, people began leaving food baskets outside the doors of quarantined neighbors without knocking. Letters were no longer handed directly, but dropped with tongs or sticks. Social greetings changed hugs and handshakes, gave way to nods or gestures from a distance. Shared water basins were removed from wells. People brought their own buckets. Wine cellars devised no-contact delivery methods, hollow canes, ropes, or window pulleys. Even within families, small adjustments occurred. Children were taught to sit further apart. Table settings grew more spaced. Stories were told not just for entertainment but to instill caution. These shifts, while subtle, reflected a deeper truth. The body itself had become dangerous. Politeness and affection had to find new expressions. Over time, each new wave of plague wore down public trust. At first, the city's coordinated response was admired. But as outbreaks continued despite quarantines and certificates, skepticism grew. Was the bureaucracy truly effective, or just efficient at documenting death? Some Venetians came to view the Sanitas not as protectors, but as instruments of control. Rumors circulated that officials exaggerated plague numbers to justify restrictions. Others claimed that lazarettos were death camps, not hospitals. This erosion of trust led to occasional unrest. Small-scale riots broke out in poorer neighborhoods when food deliveries were delayed. In some cases, watchmen were attacked or notices torn down. While these incidents were rare, they revealed a core challenge. Keeping a city locked down requires more than rules. It requires belief in their purpose. Venice's experiment in total quarantine was extraordinary, but it was also fragile. It relied not only on infrastructure but on collective endurance. And as the city's famed resilience began to fray, another question emerged. What happened after the doors finally opened? When a city that has locked itself away finally opens its gates, what is revealed is more than economic damage or a death count. It is the residue of silence, the faded scratch marks on a door sealed for quarantine, the quiet grief of survivors, the shifting norms that linger long after the illness has passed. In this final section, we follow Venice as it emerges from yet another cycle of confinement. We trace how its systems evolved, what lasting changes quarantine left in law and culture, and how memory, both personal and civic, was preserved, hidden, or forgotten. Reopening Venice after a lockdown was never a single act. It was gradual, ceremonial, and cautious. Public health officials, ever wary of reintroduction, lifted restrictions in phases. First, the outer lazarettos were cleared. Ships under quarantine were finally allowed to dock. Goods were reweighed, letters reinspected, cargoes released. Porters returned to their posts, gondolas resumed regulated service, and merchants flooded back into the Rialto market with baskets of spices, glassware, and salted meats. Then came the unsealing of homes. Watchmen removed wooden barriers. Health notices were peeled away. Neighbors reappeared in doorways. Bells rang not to mark death but to summon prayers of thanksgiving. Masses resumed in churches. Windows reopened to the breeze. Yet the joy was tempered. Many who emerged had lost family. Some homes remained shuttered. Entire blocks, once filled with voices, stood silent. Civic leaders often declared public days of cleansing. Streets were swept. Canals were flushed with seawater. Bonfires burned old mattresses and clothing. Vinegar was poured over public fountains. These acts were both symbolic and practical, part purification, part pageantry. In major outbreaks, the reopening was marked by public processions. Priests in gilded robes carried icons through the streets. Senators appeared in full regalia. Citizens walked barefoot in silence. Flags were flown, psalms sung. One of the most enduring rituals was the annual pilgrimage to the Church of the Redentor. Built in 1577 to mark the end of a devastating plague, the church became the center of Venice's remembrance tradition. Each July, a pontoon bridge was constructed across the Giudecca Canal. Thousands crossed on foot to give thanks. They remembered the deaths, the closures, and the long silences. It is a tradition that continues to this day. When the quarantine lifted, the city did not simply return to normal. Instead, it confronted the aftermath. Thousands had died, but thousands more had been economically devastated. Children without parents were placed in church-run orphanages, often raised by nuns or apprenticed into trades. Widows took in laundry or returned to needlework to survive. Men whose businesses had collapsed might join the city's navy or become minor officials in the health board. Venice attempted to offer some restitution. In some years, the state paid stipends to widows of quarantine guards. Food prices were stabilized. Tax relief was granted to certain merchants. But for many, the recovery was uneven. The poorest districts took years to stabilize. Some never fully did. One of the most remarkable aspects of Venetian quarantine was its institutional resilience. The Magistrato alla Sanità not only survived each outbreak, it strengthened. Over time, new roles were created: sanitation inspectors, port fumigators, record keepers, and door sealers. Quarantine laws were codified. Regulations for the lazarettos were refined. Systems of cargo disinfection, fumigation with herbs, airing of cloth bales, boiling of paper became increasingly elaborate. Venetian health practices were studied and copied by cities across Europe, including Marseille, Dubrovnik, and London. Even as medical theory evolved from humors to microscopic contagion, Venice's practical approach remained a model of early epidemiological management. Yet not all that Venice endured was written down. Much was forgotten, intentionally or not. The personal stories of confinement, suffering, and resilience often died with those who lived them. Diaries were lost. Oral accounts faded. The city, like many, preferred its narrative of survival to the raw truth of individual loss. Public memory focused on monuments and rituals, not on the cracks in the system. The failure of food deliveries, the corruption among guards, the quiet despair of children behind sealed doors, these received little attention. And yet the memory endured in subtler ways. A tradition of airing linens in the sun. The presence of vinegar in public water cleaning. The reluctance to speak too loudly in courtyards where whole families once disappeared. Even architecture changed. Some homes installed second staircases or hidden garden entries, escape routes of the imagination. Walls bore marks of boards once nailed. Streets were widened in some quarters to improve air circulation. Alleys that had seen the worst were renamed. The plague passed, but its imprint remained. Perhaps the deepest irony of Venice's quarantine history is this: a city built on trade, always in motion, boats, merchants, whispers across bridges, became a master of stillness. In moments of greatest threat, it didn't flee, it sealed. And in doing so, Venice became one of the first urban centers to show that organized, collective sacrifice, however difficult, could slow a disease. Not stop it, not cure it, but delay it, manage it, and offer space for survival. Quarantine was not perfect. Many still died. Many suffered unjustly. But the choice to isolate, to turn inward, remains one of the most historically striking forms of civic resilience ever recorded. As dusk fell across the lagoon and gondoliers returned to the waters and shopkeepers reopened their shutters, the city once again resumed its rhythm. But beneath that rhythm lay something learned: that silence can save, that stillness can protect, and that sometimes the greatest courage lies in staying home. Story 4: Pest houses and plague walls. Infrastructure of disease control. When we think of plague, we often imagine frantic responses, doctors in beaked masks, quarantined homes, or ships held in port. But the story of humanity's response to disease is also written in stone and mortar. Across centuries, cities and towns constructed entire buildings and barriers not just as emergency shelters, but as lasting pieces of infrastructure. Some were hastily erected during outbreaks, others became permanent features of urban design. This section explores the creation and purpose of pest houses and plague walls, the physical structures built to control contagion. These may not appear in grand histories of politics or empire, but they were decisive in shaping how communities lived, moved, and survived during the darkest times. The term pest house refers to a type of building set aside specifically to isolate the sick, particularly those afflicted with contagious diseases like plague, smallpox, or typhus. Pest houses were often located on the outskirts of towns, in marshes, near leper colonies, or adjacent to cemeteries. In some cases, they were simply abandoned buildings repurposed during an outbreak. The first purpose-built pest houses in Europe began appearing in the late Middle Ages, though the concept of isolating the sick in specific locations dates back much further. Think of biblical leper colonies or Roman military infirmaries. But during the plague years of the 14th to 17th centuries, pest houses became standard features of many towns, particularly in England, France, the Low Countries, and parts of Germany. Most pest houses were basic wooden or stone structures, without plumbing or heating, operated by city councils, parishes, or charitable guilds, manned by a small, often desperate staff of caretakers, gravediggers, and watchmen. These were not hospitals in the modern sense. There were no doctors on regular staff. Treatments, if any, were limited to herbal remedies, broths, and the administration of last rites. Entry into a pest house was rarely voluntary. Once someone was identified as showing symptoms fever, swollen buboes, or delirium, they might be forcibly removed from their home. Neighbors could report cases to local health officials. In some cities, even mild symptoms were enough to justify confinement. Family members might beg to keep their loved ones at home. Some bribed officials to avoid removal. But the public health logic was clear: isolate the sick to protect the many. In England, parish officials sometimes paid cart drivers known as searchers or bearers to transport the ill to pest houses. These men had little protection. Sometimes they wrapped patients in cloth soaked with vinegar. More often, they relied on speed and gloves. Once inside the pest house, patients were segregated by gender or disease type. Basic beds of straw or coarse linen were provided. A caretaker might offer food, wash wounds, or administer vinegar rinses. But often, those sent to pest houses died alone and unnamed. The staff of pest houses occupied a strange social position. They were simultaneously vital and shunned. Often drawn from the ranks of the poor, widowed, or criminally accused, pest house workers received wages higher than typical laborers but lived in isolation. Their duties included cleaning bodies, administering minimal care, digging mass graves, burning contaminated clothing or bedding. Some found purpose in the work. A few kept journals, noting symptoms and recovery patterns. Others succumbed to the psychological toll. There are records of pest house workers abandoning their posts, looting the dead, or falling ill themselves. Despite their marginalization, pest house staff formed a vital part of the response network, a human infrastructure working alongside stone walls and city policies. Less known than pest houses, but equally important, were plague walls, physical barriers built to isolate entire regions or prevent the spread of disease across borders. These walls appeared most notably in Central and Eastern Europe during the 17th and 18th centuries. Some of the most famous examples were constructed in what is now Slovenia, Croatia, and the southern Austrian territories. There, Local governments and military authorities ordered the creation of plague cordons, long stretches of stone walls, ditches, and guard stations. One of the most documented was the cordon sanitaire of the Habsburg Empire. During the plague waves of the 18th century, the imperial government constructed hundreds of kilometers of barrier, sometimes fortified with troops to block infected regions, particularly along the Ottoman frontier. These weren't just symbolic walls. They were staffed, guarded, and patrolled. Travelers without permits were turned away or arrested. In extreme cases, violators were shot. Similar walls were used to divide infected zones within cities. In Marseille, during the 1720-1722 outbreak, plague walls separated clean quarters from infected ones. Gates were watched, movement restricted. In smaller towns, plague containment was less formal but no less determined. Communities constructed wooden palisades around neighborhoods, fenced-in fields for quarantining livestock, temporary moats to restrict access to central areas, watch posts on hills to signal if outsiders approached. These measures required coordination. Citizens had to volunteer or be conscripted to dig, build, and patrol. Sometimes, guards were posted at crossroads with nothing more than a stick and an armband to signify authority. In alpine regions, entire valleys were blocked off by natural barriers reinforced with man-made additions. Visitors were required to pass through pest stones, isolated platforms where goods and coins could be exchanged at a distance, often doused in vinegar before use. The design of pest houses and plague walls reflected a grim kind of functionality. Few windows to limit airflow, high walls to deter escape, separate entrances for caretakers, stone-lined pits for quick burial or burning of waste. In cities with repeated outbreaks, these buildings became semi-permanent. In some cases, they were repurposed between plagues as poorhouses, prisons, or storage depots. But the name pest house often lingered, a reminder of the building's darker purpose. The psychological impact of these spaces endured. People avoided them even after their official use ended. Some became haunted in local lore. Children were told not to go near them. When cities turned to stone and mortar to fight an invisible foe, they revealed something fundamental. That fear of disease doesn't only reshape behavior, it reshapes landscapes. But as useful as these structures were, could they stop the spread? Or did they merely delay the inevitable, while people within waited, wondered, and hoped? Stone, timber, and policy may build a barrier, but it is human lives that fill the space behind it. In Section 2, we step inside the pest houses and behind the plague walls to explore what life was really like for the people confined within. How did they survive, communicate, or resist? What rules governed their routines? What did it mean to exist in a space designed not to heal, but to isolate? The grand designs of plague infrastructure were only part of the story. It's in the day-to-day through the eyes of patients, caretakers, and community members that we see how societies really responded to disease, often with quiet endurance and occasional defiance. While pest houses varied by region and resources, most shared similar characteristics: austere interiors, minimal furnishings, poor ventilation, and an overwhelming odor of sickness, vinegar, and decay. Upon admission, often forced patients were assigned to wards based on symptoms, gender, or proximity to others in their household. A typical pest house ward was a long room lined with pallets of straw or thin mattresses. Blankets were few. Privacy was non-existent. The sick were not just isolated from the healthy, they were isolated from society's memory. Their names, if recorded at all, were misspelled or abbreviated in plague ledgers. Few ever left alive. Food was basic and inconsistent: thin broth, barley gruel, or bread dipped in vinegar. The ill often relied on caretakers, or occasionally family members allowed inside, for extra sustenance. Some pest houses permitted family visits under strict supervision, though many did not. Medical care was rudimentary at best. Occasionally, a local physician might be appointed by the town, but more often, care fell to nuns, hired attendants, or even prisoners working in exchange for reduced sentences. Treatment ranged from herbal poultices to bloodletting, though increasingly, pest house medicine was focused less on cure and more on containment. Mental health deteriorated rapidly. Patients raved in fever, wept from isolation, or simply lay in silence. Some pest houses posted clergy nearby, but many could not meet demand. The death bell tolled endlessly, and each sound reminded the living of what was likely to come. Even in confinement, people clung to familiar rites. Last words were whispered to nurses or written on scraps of cloth. Some patients carried religious tokens, rosary beads, saint medals, small prayer scrolls sewn into clothing. Where clergy were present, final confessions were conducted from doorways or through windows. In Catholic pest houses, Mass might be said from outside the ward so the dying could hear it. In Protestant areas, ministers preached through walls, while attendants repeated prayers aloud for those unable to speak. Not everyone was afforded these rituals. Many died in their sleep, or alone, or in the arms of strangers. Bodies were removed quickly to reduce spread, often wrapped in the same linens in which they had died. Graves were shallow and hurried. Yet in the margins of these tragedies, caretakers often acted with extraordinary tenderness, closing the eyes of the dead, lighting a candle, murmuring a name. Despite the watchful eyes of guards and caretakers, some patients attempted to flee pest houses. There are documented cases from cities like London, Strasbourg, and Antwerp of patients breaking down doors, climbing out windows, or bribing attendants to release them at night. Motivations varied. Fear of dying alone, desire to return to family, mistrust of pest house care, rumors of intentional neglect or poisoning. These escapes terrified city officials, who feared new waves of contagion. Laws were passed to increase penalties for aiding escapees. In some cities, guards were allowed to use force. Yet for some communities, aiding escapees was an act of compassion. Families waited in the dark outside pest house walls, calling softly for loved ones. In rural areas, whole villages sometimes defied orders and hid the sick in barns or caves rather than send them to state institutions. These actions weren't always foolish. In places where pest houses were overcrowded or unsanitary, survival odds outside could be higher. While pest houses isolated the sick, plague walls isolated entire populations. In cities like Marseille, regions were divided by physical walls manned by soldiers or civic guards. Each gate became a checkpoint. Residents of the infected zone were not permitted to pass into the clean areas, even for food or water. These walls often stayed up for months, and in some cases, years. What was life like inside a cordon quarter? Resource scarcity, food shortages were common. Wealthy families stockpiled supplies, the poor went hungry. Black markets thrived. Some walls had drop points where sacks of flour or jugs of oil were exchanged for coins soaked in vinegar. Communication. Messages were smuggled across walls rolled into tubes, tied to animals, or thrown over fences. Families used colored cloth signals in windows to communicate simple messages: green for well, red for sick, black for dead. Community organization. Block leaders emerged, coordinating water collection, burial details, and herbal distribution. In some areas, informal neighborhood watch systems helped enforce or resist quarantine based on local opinion. Suspicion and stigma. The longer the walls remained, the more mistrust grew. Those outside feared those within. Rumors of plague being feigned for sympathy or hidden to escape confinement abounded. When the walls eventually came down, social reintegration was slow. Not everyone lived inside or outside the walls. Some existed in between. Plague watchmen were tasked with guarding gates, delivering food and reporting breaches. Poorly paid and poorly protected, they wore marked clothing sashes, badges, or bells to signal their liminal status. Couriers, often young boys or elderly men, carried messages and supplies across neutral zones. Some were volunteers, others were conscripted. They developed their own rules, cleaning coins with urine, leaving packages in designated pest holes, never speaking directly. Nurses and attendants, permitted to move between wards or over plague walls, formed the essential backbone of the containment effort. Some wore protective gear, leather hoods, waxed robes, amulets. Others relied on routine, vinegar rinses, avoiding touch, prayer. These workers often died in service, but their roles made the entire infrastructure possible. Without them, pest houses and plague walls were just structures. With them, they became functional systems, flawed but alive. In the quiet space behind the walls and inside the low, wooden doors of the pest house, life continued, not vibrant or healthy but determined. Meals were cooked, songs were sung, prayers were whispered, jokes were told. People adapted and adapted again, even in the face of repeated despair. But when the plague finally passed, what happened to these spaces of sorrow? Were they torn down, repurposed, or left to rot? Structures built in crisis are rarely meant to last forever. Pest houses crumble. Plague walls are dismantled. But even as wood decays and stone is repurposed, the legacy of these spaces lingers in public memory, in town records, and sometimes in the very layout of the cities they once confined. In this final section, we explore what became of the physical and cultural infrastructure of disease once the plague faded. Were these places erased or preserved? How were they remembered or deliberately forgotten? And how did their presence shape the next generation's response to disease? As outbreaks ended and fear subsided, pest houses were typically the first structures to be abandoned. Some cities attempted to maintain them for future use, keeping a skeleton staff or converting them into almshouses or poor shelters. But more often, they fell into disrepair. Wooden pest houses rotted quickly, roofs collapsed, fences were pulled down and repurposed. Insects, rodents, and time overtook what had once been sites of intense suffering. The locations of many early pest houses, especially in rural England, France, and Italy, are now lost. Their existence survives only in names on maps: Pestfield Lane, Deadman's Ditch, or Lazaretto Hill. In some regions, land where pest houses stood was considered tainted for generations. Few would build there. In others, the buildings were quietly dismantled, as if removing the structure could erase the memory of what happened inside. And yet, some pest houses remained visible, standing alone on the edges of town, serving as grim reminders. In 18th century London, for example, the remains of pest houses near the Smithfield and Clerkenwell districts lingered long enough to be repurposed as military hospitals and later workhouses. A curious phenomenon emerged in the 18th and 19th centuries: the conversion of pest houses into institutions of discipline and poverty management. In a world increasingly obsessed with class, order, and cleanliness, buildings once used to isolate the contagious were used to isolate the socially undesirable. Former pest houses became workhouses for the poor, asylums for the mentally ill, infirmaries for the elderly, jails for minor offenders. This reuse reflected a practical view of infrastructure. Buildings on the outskirts, already associated with suffering and isolation, were well suited to tasks that society wanted kept out of sight. However, this transition also reflected a troubling continuity. These were still places where the unwanted were sent to disappear. The sick, the poor, the unruly, each group found themselves behind the same walls, with only the labels changed. The removal of plague walls was often a public event. Gates reopened, fences came down. In some cities, celebrations were held as neighborhoods were reunited. But in other cases, Walls weren't physically removed, they were simply absorbed. Brick by brick, stones were reused for other structures. A plague wall might become the foundation of a new granary or be built into a barn. No sign marked its former use. And yet, just as with pest houses, traces remained. In Ljubljana, Slovenia, segments of plague walls still stand as part of modern road systems. In parts of southern France, earthworks that once marked infected zones now blend into farm boundaries. Urban planners, consciously or not, preserved these paths. Roads and footpaths still follow the lines once drawn by contagion. The memory of separation is etched into the movement of people long after the reason has been forgotten. How a community chose to remember its pest houses and plague walls depended on culture, religion, and the scale of trauma. Some erected plague columns or chapels. In parts of Central Europe, richly carved stone monuments were built to honor saints believed to have protected the town. These were often placed near former pest houses or at the edge of areas once sealed off. Others built churches of redemption, such as Venice's Church of the Redentor or Vienna's Karlskirche. These magnificent structures served both as thanks for deliverance and as physical markers of past suffering. But just as often, memory was buried. Town records were lost, burned, or censored. In Protestant England, the Reformation's rejection of saintly intercession meant fewer physical memorials were built. In parts of Eastern Europe, plague history was subsumed into folklore-whispered stories about sick hills or forbidden paths. Still, oral traditions persisted. Children were told not to play near certain ruins. Elders remembered names of plague victims 3 generations gone, and in some cases, written records dusty and forgotten remained in parish registries and city archives, waiting for historians centuries later. Pest houses and plague walls, as primitive as they were, offered a foundational idea that the physical structuring of space could save lives. Centuries later, that idea remains. During 19th century cholera outbreaks, cities turned again to segregation and sanitation. During the 1918 influenza pandemic, public buildings were repurposed as quarantine wards. And in the 21st century, during the COVID-19 pandemic, the logic of separation lockdowns, isolation zones, makeshift field hospitals reappeared in digital form and modern materials. Few realized, perhaps, that the same logic had guided the construction of a small stone wall outside a Croatian village, or the timber framework of a 16th century pest house in northern France. The materials change, the core principle remains. Even today, we live with the language and layout left behind by pest houses and plague infrastructure. The word quarantine, born from 40 days of waiting. The term lazaretto, still used for quarantine facilities in ports. Place names like Plague Road or Dead Lane, hidden in street signs. And in the quiet corners of many European towns, if you know where to look, you may still find the remnants. A stone arch overgrown with ivy, a sunken path once guarded day and night, a field where no one builds. These are the silent witnesses not just to disease, but to the human need to organize, contain, and survive. The pest houses may be gone, the walls may have fallen, but the memory lives on, not always visible, not always acknowledged, but present, in the way we plan cities, in the stories we tell our children, in the policies we enact when disease returns. Because return it does. And when it does, we build again. Story 5. Herbs, Smoke, and Amulets, how scent was used to ward off death. When the plague swept through Europe again and again, few things frightened people more than the air itself. Long before bacteria were known, the belief in miasma foul, corrupted air dominated the understanding of disease. In response, people across classes turned to the senses, especially smell, as a form of protection. This story delves into the pervasive role of scent as a defense against plague through herbs, incense, amulets, aromatic oils, and smoke. Far from superstition alone, these practices reveal a layered history of early medical theory, cultural ritual, and sensory survival strategies. This was not just a world of masks and walls, it was a world filled with lavender, sulfur, garlic, and burnt resin. The idea that bad air caused illness has ancient roots. Hippocrates described winds that brought sickness. Galen expanded the theory to include putrefaction, a kind of atmospheric rot. By the time plague reached Europe in the 14th century, this belief was not just medical, it was deeply cultural. People believed disease could enter the body through the nose and lungs. Thick, damp, or stagnant air was especially feared. If foul smells surrounded you, they thought the air was tainted and with it your health. In cities where waste, corpses, and sewage were unavoidable, this theory felt tragically plausible. And so, in an effort to fight unseen air, people turned to scent, both pleasant and pungent. Everyday homes, especially during the height of plague season, were transformed into aromatic sanctuaries. Bundles of herbs were hung from rafters, windows, and bedposts. These weren't just decorative, they were protective barriers. Common household herbs included lavender, known for its calming fragrance, believed to purify the air and soothe the body. Rosemary, burned or steeped in water, often used to wash hands or scent a room. Sage, boiled into teas or added to vinegars for body rubs. Rue, a bitter herb thought to repel demons and contagion alike. Mint and marjoram, infused in water, used to wipe surfaces or refresh breath. Some households combined herbs into plague posies, small bouquets carried by hand, worn around the neck, or tied to hats. This wasn't just a sweet gesture, it was a medical tactic based on the sensory logic of the time. Even children were given little pouches of dried herbs, tied with string and placed under pillows or around their waists. These were, in their eyes, invisible armor. Herbs weren't only smelled, they were burned. The practice of fumigation became standard in plague-ridden cities. Authorities recommended filling homes, streets, and even churches with purifying smoke. The logic was simple. If foul air caused disease, then fragrant or acrid smoke could overpower or drive it out. Materials burned included juniper branches, crackling and aromatic, often used in rural areas. Frankincense and myrrh, expensive but revered for their religious and medical value. Sulfur, acrid and overwhelming, believed to kill any pestilence outright. Pitch and tar, sticky, dark smoke used to coat city air during major outbreaks. Ambergris or benzoin resin, burned in wealthier homes or cathedrals. Fumigation was done room by room. Windows and doors were closed, incense was lit, and thick smoke was allowed to fill the space. People believed it cleansed the air and, by extension, the body. Public spaces were also fumigated. Markets, courtrooms, and even quarantine checkpoints burned herbs or vinegar-soaked wood. Some towns hired fumigation men to walk through streets waving censers of smoke. Beyond practical herbs, there was another world of plague protection: the amulet. These small objects, worn, carried, or hidden, often combined scent, symbolism, and superstition. Examples included wax amulets embedded with herbs and pressed with religious symbols, hollow lockets, pomanders, containing perfumed wax or dried flower petals, cloth sachets filled with dried rosemary, rue, and rose petals stitched shut and pinned to clothing, perfumed beads made from crushed herbs and resin, worn as necklaces, balsam-soaked medals depicting plague saints like Saint Roch or Saint Sebastian. These items were believed to create a protective halo of fragrance. Some were blessed by priests, others were charged with magical inscriptions. Even those skeptical of saints or charms often wore scented leather or cloth discs under their collars. The idea was consistent: saturate the air around your face with something pleasant or powerful. Among the wealthy, the defense against plague became more elaborate and expensive. High-status Venetians, Parisians, and Londoners commissioned custom perfumes for protection. Apothecaries offered plague colognes distillations of rose water, orange peel, clove oil, and cinnamon. These were dabbed on the wrists, poured into bath water, or sprinkled on gloves and masks. Some aristocrats carried ivory-handled scent fans, waving them gently to cleanse the air before them. Others kept silver pomanders, gilded spheres that opened to reveal layers of scented wax. Elaborate fragrance rituals became part of morning routines. Wipe hands with rosewater vinegar. Anoint the temples with lavender oil. Light a small incense cone before leaving the house. In this way, personal scent became a form of social defense. To smell sweet was not just pleasant, it suggested health, wealth, and moral purity. One of the most famous aromatic plague remedies was the legendary Four Thieves vinegar. According to lore, during a plague outbreak in Toulouse, 4 thieves were caught robbing the homes of the dead and dying. When arrested, they offered their secret, a vinegar infused with aromatic herbs that protected them from infection. Though the story is mythologized, the recipe became widely circulated. Variations appeared in medical manuals, almanacs, and household books. Typical ingredients included vinegar, rosemary, lavender, sage, wormwood, clove, camphor, mint, garlic. People rubbed it on their skin, soaked cloths in it for masks, or even drank diluted doses. It was sold at markets, made at home, and passed down through families. Today, historians debate whether it offered any real protection. But to the people of the time, it offered structure, ritual, and a sense of action, and in a plague-stricken world, that was powerful medicine in itself. The war against plague wasn't fought only in hospitals or behind walls. It was fought in the air through scent, smoke, and the unseen lines people drew between themselves and danger. But was this reliance on aroma a genuine form of prevention, or simply a sensory comfort in a world where control was slipping away? In plague-stricken societies, the use of scent was not merely personal or spiritual, it became political. As the fear of invisible contagion mounted, municipal authorities, religious leaders, and healers alike attempted to harness the olfactory world in ways that shaped public behavior and reinforced power. In Section 2, we step beyond the household herb bundle and into the larger systems of authority and belief that govern the air itself. From the smoky rituals of incense-laden churches to the vinegar-splashed rules of municipal health boards, scent was everywhere used to protect, purify, and most importantly, control. In the ecclesiastical world, incense was more than ritual, it was defense. Centuries before the plague, churches burned frankincense and myrrh as symbols of prayer and purification. During outbreaks, this sacred smoke took on heightened importance. It was believed to cleanse not just spiritual sin, but physical corruption. During plague years, masses were preceded by heavy fumigation of pews and altars. Procession, though sometimes banned, carried censers swinging smoke into alleys and courtyards. Monasteries doubled incense rations, and clergy were advised to breathe smoke before administering last rites. In regions like Spain and Italy, the burning of incense became a public spectacle. Church bells tolled as clouds of sweet, thick smoke poured from cathedral doors, both a reassurance and a warning. Interestingly, many of the resins used, benzoin, storax, frankincense, did have mild antimicrobial properties, but their main role was symbolic, to mark sacred space and reclaim contaminated air for God. Secular authorities also recognized the power of scent, especially smoke and vinegar, as a way to manage public fear and demonstrate control. By the 17th century, cities like Paris, Venice, and Amsterdam had formal ordinances that regulated the fumigation of markets, courthouses, jail cells, bridges, and alleyways. Plague carts and death rooms. Municipal health boards ordered public smokings where barrels of pitch and resin were lit in plazas. Vendors burned herbs at their stalls. Infected homes were cleansed by guards who lit vinegar-soaked coals in basins, sometimes leaving them for hours. These weren't suggestions, they were requirements. Violating fumigation orders could result in fines or even confinement. In cities like Florence, hired fumigators, men with long poles tipped with burning resin, walked assigned routes, tasked with purifying corners, entrances, and even privies. As with most forms of plague survival, access to aromatic protection was deeply stratified. The elite could afford rare spices, custom oils, and imported perfumes. The poor made do with what they could grow or scavenge. The wealthy carried pomanders made of silver, lined with velvet and packed with cloves, nutmeg, and musk. The middle class might own a few wax tablets or sachets from the local apothecary, perhaps some rosemary and mint. The poor relied on garlic, onions, vinegar, or rags soaked in herbs, tied to sticks or worn beneath the shirt. This division was not lost on society. To smell pleasant was increasingly associated with health, cleanliness, and virtue. To smell foul or worse, to smell like sickness, marked someone as dangerous or low-born. Thus, scent became a form of social policing. Aromatic presentation, whether natural or artificial, was scrutinized. In some regions, people accused of smelling wrong were suspected of hiding illness or spreading contagion. The nose became a social censor, constantly on guard. Plague eras were boom times for apothecaries, who combined the skills of pharmacists, perfumers, and folk healers. They crafted not only tonics and syrups, but bespoke scent protections tailored to their clientele. In plague time apothecaries, one might find dried citrus peel wrapped in wax cloth, rose water with vinegar for face washing, syrups of aniseed or fennel, charcoal lozenges blended with herbs, aromatic vinegars with layers of infusion. Apothecaries kept herb books, mixing old Galenic theory with regional wisdom. Some created proprietary blends, names like Essentia Contra Morbum or the Duke's Vinegar. These were advertised through word of mouth or printed broadsheets. Recipes varied wildly. Some included opium, ambergris, or even powdered emerald. Others used common ingredients with flare black peppercorns, pine resin, or burned wool. Packaging often featured religious symbols, royal seals, or inscriptions in Latin designed to signal legitimacy. Alongside medicine and policy came belief deeply woven with scent. In much of Europe, the olfactory world was both sacred and magical. Dried herbs were placed beneath the thresholds of doors to keep evil winds out. Garlands of garlic were hung not only for scent, but to drive away witches or spirits. Juniper smoke was thought to make demons visible. Rue, pungent and sharp, was called the herb of grace, and sometimes used in exorcisms. Superstitions layered on top of miasmatic theory. A person might fumigate their home while also chanting prayers or burying animal bones in the yard. Belief in scent's power did not always distinguish between science and folklore. One curious custom in parts of rural France involved placing a clove of garlic and a small coin in the mouth of the deceased before burial to purify the soul and ward off posthumous contagion. In Hungary and parts of Transylvania, bundles of wormwood and yarrow were worn in the hat, believed to confuse wandering spirits that carried disease. Perhaps the most haunting role scent played was in remembrance. Survivors often associated certain smells, good or bad, with the trauma of plague. The smell of lavender might recall a lost mother who washed linens with it. The cloying scent of incense could evoke funerals, last rites, or the eerie quiet of shuttered chapels. The acrid bite of sulfur smoke might bring back memory of a city burning away its dead. Years later, people reported that even a whiff of vinegar could induce a kind of panic, a visceral flash of plague times. As a result, some families banned certain smells from the home entirely. Others clung to them, burning rosemary every winter or carrying herb pouches long after plague had passed, just in case. The olfactory memory is powerful, rooted deeply in the brain. And for those who lived through plague, scent became not only protection but a lingering ghost. The fight against plague wasn't always fought with swords or salves. It was fought through rituals of the nose, steeping, burning, perfuming, inhaling. In the hands of governments, priests, mothers, and apothecaries, scent became a defense, a doctrine, and a daily act of resistance. But in time, as germ theory took hold, what became of these aromatic traditions? Were they discarded as superstition, or did they survive, changed but intact? As Europe inched into the Enlightenment and beyond, a seismic shift occurred in how illness was understood. Germs replaced vapors. Microscopes replaced incense burners. Slowly but surely, scent lost its place as a frontline defense against plague. But old habits die slowly, especially those steeped in ritual, sensory comfort, and centuries of shared trauma. In this final section, we trace the decline of scent-based plague prevention, the transformation of aromatic traditions into modern medicine, and the quiet endurance of ancient beliefs even into our own time. By the mid-19th century, scientific advances began unraveling the miasma theory that had dominated Europe for centuries. In 1847, Ignaz Semmelweis demonstrated the role of hand-washing in preventing puerperal fever. In the 1850s, John Snow's study of cholera transmission via contaminated water challenged the idea of bad air. By the 1860s, 1880s, Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch were isolating bacteria and laying the foundations of germ theory. These discoveries were not just theoretical, they had public health consequences. Smoke, scent, and herbal posies were now seen as medically irrelevant, charming relics of a superstitious age. Fumigation declined. Perfumed pomanders were mocked in scientific journals. Herbal amulets were dismissed as folk nonsense. Cities invested instead in sewer systems, clean water supplies, sanitation departments, quarantine hospitals with airflow design based on germ containment. Yet even as science advanced, many people, especially in rural areas, continued to rely on aromatic traditions. For them, what had once worked was not easily dismissed, especially when science was still slow to reach the poor. While the belief in scent's power to repel disease faded, the use of aromatic compounds never truly disappeared. Instead, it evolved into modern pharmacology and cosmetic science. The same herbs once burned in plague fires were now extracted, standardized, and bottled. Lavender oil became a calming tincture. Eucalyptus found use in chest rubs and cough lozenges. Clove oil became an antiseptic in dental care. Camphor was used in salves and balms for respiratory relief. Vinegar solutions were reinvented as cleaning agents and tonics. Apothecaries, once half mystic, half chemist, transformed into pharmacists. The botanical knowledge built through centuries of plague defense was codified, tested, and monetized. And though scent was no longer seen as disease prevention, it retained a psychological role. Aromatic products were marketed as revitalizing, refreshing, or clarifying. The air may no longer spread plague, but people still believed clean air could improve mood and vitality. In the 20th century, especially post-WWI and WWII, there was a minor resurgence in the belief that scents could heal. The birth of aromatherapy as a term is credited to French chemist René Maurice Gattefossé in the 1930s. His experiments with lavender oil on burns led to a broader interest in essential oils as holistic medicine. This was not a return to miasma theory, but rather a new interpretation of scent as stress relief, immune support, mood regulation, respiratory aid. Essential oil diffusers became a staple of holistic health stores. The ancient idea of cleansing a space with aroma resurfaced, not to repel demons or miasmas, but to calm the nervous system. Many of the same herbs used in plague times reappeared. Frankincense, rosemary, lavender, lemon balm, tea tree, peppermint. Though separated by centuries, the reasoning was strangely familiar. Bad air makes us sick, good air helps us heal. In the early 21st century, when the world faced another global pandemic, COVID-19, some curious echoes of plague time scent culture returned. People burned sage and Palo Santo to cleanse rooms. Vinegar and citrus-based cleaning agents were used obsessively. Essential oil sales surged. Fragrant masks with herbal inserts became a cottage industry. Memes and guides circulated about plague doctor blends of oils. And perhaps most poignantly, loss of smell became a key symptom of the virus suddenly. The sense once used to detect danger was itself a sign of infection. Scent, long relegated to cosmetic and nostalgic roles, was briefly thrust back into medical relevance, not as a protector, but as a diagnostic marker, an inversion of its historical role. It served as a haunting reminder. What we can smell or no longer smell still shapes how we understand health. Even in our sterile, scientific age, vestiges of plague-era scent culture persist. Sprigs of rosemary at funerals, the scent of incense in religious rituals, healing bath soaks with herbs and salts, lavender-filled eye pillows for sleep, cultural customs of burning herbs before major life events. Across the globe, people continue to engage with scent as something meaningful, even if they no longer believe it wards off death. The old fears remain, reshaped into wellness trends, traditions, or personal rituals. The herbs still grow, the smoke still rises, and somewhere, someone is tying a bundle of dried flowers and placing it above a doorway, not as protection from plague, but perhaps just in case. In the end, the battle between plague and people was not just fought in the blood or lungs, but in the air itself. The belief in scented defense, however flawed, speaks to a deeper human truth. When the enemy is invisible, we defend with all the senses we have. Scent offered comfort, control, a sensory ritual in the chaos. Whether in a pomander clutched by a nobleman, a garlic bundle hung in a peasant's kitchen, or a censer swung by a priest in a smoky chapel, scent was a barrier, a balm, and a prayer. And perhaps it still is. Story 6. Guardians of the Gate, the lives of plague watchmen and quarantine enforcers. In the battle against the plague, not all defenders wore robes or carried incense. Some bore no medical training, no religious authority, and no wealth to protect them. Yet they stood day and night at the thresholds of infected homes, at the edges of towns, along the borders of entire nations. These were the plague watchmen. Hired by cities and towns across Europe, plague watchmen were the human barricades between the healthy and the sick. Their job was simple to describe, yet grim in execution: keep the diseased from leaving, keep the healthy from entering, and ensure that quarantine was not a suggestion, but a command. This section explores who these men were, how they lived, what they endured, and what happened when the very people they guarded turned on them. The idea of using guards to enforce plague control likely evolved from existing night watchmen, municipal employees, charged with patrolling city streets to prevent theft, fires, or disorder. By the late 14th century, as plague became a recurring threat, cities realized they needed something more targeted. Men who could be posted outside homes, stationary guards dedicated to enforcing quarantine laws. In places like Florence, London, Antwerp, and Prague, civic councils issued ordinances calling for watchmen at the doors of infected households, guards at city gates and along plague walls, runners or messengers who would report breaches or death. These men became known by various names: plague watchers, quarantine keepers, house guards, door sitters, sentinels. In England, simply the watch. Their tools were basic: a staff, a lantern, and a written order of authority. Their world was one of silence, stench, and suspicion. Unlike doctors or apothecaries, plague watchmen were not drawn from the educated elite. Instead, they were laborers, drifters, ex-soldiers, or the unemployed men with little to lose and few other options. Some were desperate for income. Others saw the role as a kind of civic duty. A few were criminals, offered the job in lieu of prison. Qualifications varied in many cities. Age mattered more than skill. Older men were thought to have less to lose. Some were selected because they had survived plague before and were assumed immune. Others were assigned the role against their will, especially in emergencies. Wages ranged widely. In London in the 1600s, a watchman might earn 6 to 8 pence a day, plus rations and a cloak. In smaller towns, pay was often inconsistent or symbolic: a loaf of bread, a few coins, or the promise of housing after the outbreak ended. Few were paid well, fewer still were remembered. The watchman's post, duties and isolation. The core duty of a plague watchman was to prevent escape. When a household was marked for quarantine due to illness or death, the doors were sealed, often from the outside, and the watchman was posted nearby. Typical tasks included sitting outside the infected house for 40 days, or until all within were dead or recovered, preventing family members from leaving, monitoring deliveries of food and water, reporting new deaths or worsening conditions, fending off those who tried to break in, rob, or flee. In London, watchmen sat by plague-marked homes, identifiable by a red or black cross painted on the door, often with the words, "Lord, have mercy upon us." These marks were both warning and curse. To sit beside such a house for weeks was a test of mental and physical endurance. Some watchmen sat on stools under crude shelters. Others stood for hours, exposed to weather. Many brought no weapons, though some carried clubs or pikes. They were vulnerable to abuse, bribery, or violence. Between the living and the dead. Perhaps the hardest part of the watchman's job was the psychological burden. They listened to coughing, crying, and sometimes screams through thin wooden walls. They witnessed wagons take bodies from doorsteps. They heard families beg to be let out. Some died at their posts. They were often shunned by neighbors and friends. Seen as tainted or expendable, they lived in isolation even when off duty. Some slept in stables, others in plague huts. A few simply lived outside for months, moving from post to post. Despite their sacrifice, watchmen were rarely praised. At best, they were tolerated. At worst, they were blamed, accused of spreading disease, stealing from the dead, or abusing their power. And yet, without them, quarantine was meaningless. Breaches and bribes, when quarantine failed. The temptation to escape or help someone else escape was immense. Some watchmen took bribes, food, coins, even promises of future favors. A few helped people flee through back doors or alleys. Cities responded with harsh penalties. In Milan and Venice, watchmen found guilty of letting someone out could be jailed, flogged, or even executed. In England, they faced public whipping or permanent dismissal. Despite the risks, breaches happened often. Desperate families broke windows or burrowed through walls. Watchmen fell asleep, disappeared, or faked illness to avoid duty. In one London case, a watchman collapsed from exhaustion and died, only for the quarantined family to flee before his body was discovered. Still, many watchmen held their post enduring hunger, threats, and bitter cold. to maintain the invisible line between plague and public. A life of thankless service. What became of plague watchmen after the crisis passed? Most simply disappeared unmarked, unnamed, and often unpaid. A few tried to claim wages owed but were ignored or dismissed. Others found that their association with the plague had marked them forever. In some towns, watchmen were banned from returning to their previous jobs. Employers feared they were carriers. There are scattered records of watchmen ending their lives in poorhouses or begging on the street. Rarely a watchman was honored. A town might grant a small pension. A name might appear in a local chronicle. But for most, obscurity was their only reward. And yet without them, countless quarantines would have failed. Entire outbreaks might have spread beyond control. For every well-known physician or heroic nurse of the plague era, there were dozens of nameless men who sat in the cold, watching a door, making sure no one crossed a line. Their stories are mostly lost. But in the margins of parish registers, city ledgers, and coroner's notes, their presence remains. Who were these quiet guardians, and how did they shape the survival or collapse of entire communities? The plague watchman was a paradox, powerful yet disposable, visible but ignored, feared yet forgotten. These men stood at the volatile crossroads of sickness and society. In Section 2, we follow their changing role from trusted enforcers to objects of suspicion and explore how their authority could be manipulated, challenged, or even violently overthrown. In the pressure cooker of quarantined cities, the watchman's post often became more than a job. It was a site of conflict, bribery, heroism, and betrayal. Authority in a time of fear. When a city declared quarantine, the edicts were sweeping. Movement was restricted, markets shuttered, homes sealed, streets emptied. To enforce these measures, civic councils depended on men of unequal authority, plague watchmen. Unlike police or magistrates, watchmen held narrow but absolute power over a single home, block, or gate. They were given written orders, often signed by plague officials or local lords, allowing them to deny entry to anyone approaching infected zones, apprehend those violating lockdowns, confiscate goods brought to or from sick houses, detain the ill and report new cases. Yet the effectiveness of this power depended entirely on public compliance, and that was never guaranteed. Tools of control, from seals to staffs. To carry out their duties, watchmen were issued a modest arsenal of tools. A staff, often white or red, signaling their role. A lantern or torch for nighttime duty. A badge or written pass with the seal of local authorities. Pitch or wax seals used to mark doors as closed by order. In London and other cities, watchmen were also given chalk or paint to mark plague homes with crosses or initials. Sometimes they bore bells to warn people they approached. But the most powerful tools weren't physical, they were isolation, surveillance, and the threat of punishment. Fear did much of the work. Yet as fear waned or desperation grew, these tools became meaningless. Resistance and defiance, the public pushes back. Though some households accepted quarantine quietly, others resisted fiercely. Watchmen were verbally abused by those they guarded, assaulted by families seeking to flee, spat on or targeted with chamber pots from windows, lied to about sickness or death within the house. In some cases, entire neighborhoods conspired to help quarantined families escape. Windows were unbarred, food was passed secretly, watchmen were lured away or threatened. In 17th century Naples, riots erupted when guards tried to enforce a strict citywide lockdown. In parts of France, watchmen disappeared, likely murdered or bribed into silence. 1645 record from Prague details how a group of young men, armed with kitchen knives and hammers, attacked a pair of door guards and carried off a sick friend into hiding. These acts were not mere rebellion. They were acts of survival in a world where to be marked sick was often a death sentence. Bribery, corruption, and the black market of escape. The watchman's low pay and poor oversight made him a ripe target for corruption. Bribes became common and, in some cases, expected. In return for coin, meat, or alcohol, a watchman might allow a family member to go for air, permit an early release from quarantine, turn a blind eye to secret visitors, fail to report a new death, pass messages, smuggle goods, or deliver false reports. In larger cities, entire networks of corrupt watchmen emerged. Some worked with apothecaries or undertakers to extort the sick. Others acted as gatekeepers for black market trade in food, medicine, and forged health certificates. A 1630 Venetian report describes watchmen hired by nobility to guard estates in name only, while entire households continued to host guests, parties, or clandestine travel. Punishments for corrupt watchmen included whipping, imprisonment, fines, public shamming, in rare cases, execution. But enforcement was spotty and evidence hard to prove. Most cases were simply forgotten. When watchmen became prisoners, the irony of the watchman's life was that his post was also his prison. Assigned to a door or alley, he could not leave until released or reassigned. If he became sick, he was often left to die in place. Watchmen who refused duty faced fines or jail. Those who deserted were hunted down, especially if their absence led to an outbreak. Some watchmen found themselves quarantined with the very people they were guarding. Once a household became too dangerous to approach, a watchman might be locked inside with them to see things through. In Milan, several plague houses were intentionally burned with watchmen inside to contain the infection. Whether this was policy or panic remains unclear. Moments of honor, when watchmen were heroes. Despite the corruption and violence, some watchmen performed acts of quiet bravery. Parish records and local chronicles hint at men who refused bribes and reported violations, nursed the sick inside homes when no one else would, recovered stolen goods from looters, died at their post rather than abandon duty, buried the dead when gravediggers refused. One 1603 London account describes a watchman named William Piers who stood his ground 6 weeks, fed 3 households, and gave up his coin to keep their fire alight. He died of plague shortly before the lockdown ended. Another in Lyon tells of Henry Legrand, who guarded a leper house and buried 17 corpses with his own hands before collapsing himself. These were not celebrated in their time, but they represent the thin line between chaos and order during a crisis. Cultural memory and public scorn. After outbreaks, plague watchmen were rarely honored. They were seen as unclean, complicit in suffering, symbols of control and confinement. In plays, pamphlets, and gossip, they were caricatured as buffoons, thugs, or cowards. Watchmen appeared in Elizabethan drama as comic relief, dull men asleep at their posts, duped by cunning servants or brave lovers. In 1665, Londoners wrote verses mocking them. The watchman bold who guardeth not, but dreams of coin and meat ill-bought. Yet the reality was far bleaker. Most watchmen were ordinary men in impossible roles, expected to be both guardian and jailer, enforcer and scapegoat. They stood between a fearful public and the creeping tide of death, holding their ground as best they could, for pay that barely bought bread, and for praise that never came. What happened when the plague ended? Were they forgot, or did the very systems they upheld begin to unravel in their absence? As the final bodies were buried and the death carts rolled away, a strange quiet returned to Europe's plague-stricken cities. Life crept back in slowly, markets reopened, churches resumed services, and the healthy dared to walk freely again. But for the plague watchman, the end of an outbreak did not bring triumph. It brought uncertainty, poverty, and often complete erasure. In this final section, we explore what became of these reluctant sentinels once their services were no longer needed. What legacy, if any, did they leave behind? The abrupt end: go home, you're no longer needed. Plague did not always vanish with ceremony. In many outbreaks, infection simply slowed until city officials declared the crisis over. Quarantines were lifted, houses unsealed, temporary laws repealed. For plague watchmen, this often meant instant unemployment. There were no formal demobilization ceremonies. Most cities provided no pensions, no medical care, no official thanks. A few received a final day's wage, often late or reduced. Others got nothing. In cities like London, Venice, or Hamburg, some records note watchmen pleading with local councils for unpaid dues or food assistance. Their petitions were frequently ignored. Many were left physically weakened, having spent weeks outdoors, exposed to disease, poorly fed, and without shelter. The moment the threat ended, they became undesirable relics of an era no one wanted to remember. Marked by the plague, even if they had avoided infection, watchmen bore an invisible mark: association with the sick and dying. This stigma could linger for months, even years. Employers refused to hire former watchmen. Neighbors avoided them. Some were accused of carrying plague, even if healthy. In small towns, they were often known by name and shunned. The psychological scars ran deep. Diaries from the 17th century mention men who stood the watch during the London plague and later wandered the streets, unwashed and raving, unable to reintegrate into normal life. In some cities, watchmen were banned from returning to their old homes, seen as potential carriers, even if months had passed since the outbreak. Disappearing from the record. While cities documented doctors, priests, and noble donors, watchmen rarely earned mention beyond administrative lists. In parish registries, their names might appear only if they died. Their burial was often in mass graves, listed with the general poor. Some towns burned their quarantine records after each plague, erasing all traces. One 17th century Italian clerk wrote, "We forget the names of those who sat and waited, for they are as common as the fleas that carried the curse." There are, however, rare exceptions: letters or diaries that mention a watchman's kindness, his loyalty, or his fall from grace. These scraps, while few, offer a glimpse of individual lives caught in the machinery of plague control. The erosion of the watchman's role. By the 18th century, the nature of plague response had changed. As germ theory replaced miasma theory, public health responses became more centralized and medicalized. The role of the lone watchman gave way to structured quarantine stations, police forces and military checkpoints, medical inspectors with training and official uniforms. Even before germ theory took hold, cities began experimenting with plague boards, quarantine hospitals, and coordinated response teams. The crude system of posting an ill-equipped man outside a door for 40 days was increasingly seen as inefficient and medieval. In Venice, the last official watchmen were phased out by the mid-1700s. In France, plague surveillance shifted to gendarmerie forces. In England, the role faded after the last major outbreaks in the 1660s. By the 19th century, the plague watchman had become an archaic figure, remembered only in folk stories and satirical pamphlets. Legacy in language and lore. Though forgotten in official histories, the image of the watchman endured in more subtle ways. Keeping watch remains a phrase denoting vigilance and sacrifice. In parts of rural Italy and Greece, old men posted outside homes during sickness are still called guardiani, a faint echo of plague-era tradition. In some European ghost stories, the plague watchman became a symbol of death's attendant, a silent figure waiting by the door. Children's rhymes in 18th century Germany referred to the bellman who knocks when all is not well. These fragments suggest that the psychological presence of the watchman, the man who sat, watched, and stood between life and death, remained even as the historical details faded. What do we owe the watchman? In modern times, we have hospitals, public health campaigns, and coordinated emergency services. But during the plague, it was often the untrained, underpaid watchmen who kept order. They enforced unpleasant laws. They faced public anger. They stood alone. And most of them died or vanished into anonymity. These were not heroes in shining armor. They were men in heavy cloaks, bearing staffs, coughing quietly in the night. Yet their presence, however imperfect, slowed the spread of death, held the social fabric together, and provided some semblance of structure amid chaos. Their sacrifice, unrecognized in their own time, remains a silent testament to the unglamorous labor of survival. Reflection: invisible walls, forgotten guards. Today, we enforce quarantines through digital tracking, hospital isolation, and media alerts. But the principle remains the same. Someone must stand at the boundary between danger and safety. In times of plague, that someone was often a man with no training, no future, and no reward, just a stool, a lantern, and an order not to let anyone in or out. When we remember the great doctors, the city planners, the monarchs who issued edicts, we should also remember the watchman, the one who watched because someone had to.